The sun scorched the fields of Virginia in 1824, burning the sweat into the black skin of those forced to toil beneath the overseer's lash. Among them, Ezekiel, a young blacksmith enslaved from birth, bore blows that left his body broken but his mind unbowed. Each crack of the whip echoed like a hammer striking iron, and each scar became a silent promise etched into his flesh. By night, he retreated to the forge, the air thick with soot, firelight dancing across walls, illuminating the tools of his clandestine craft. For every overseer who struck him, Ezekiel would fashion a final resting place, iron graves, cold and unyielding, forged from his fury and grief. And as the first completed coffin emerged from the shadows of the forge, a whisper swept through the plantation. The blacksmith's revenge had begun, silent, inevitable, and deadly. Ezekiel was born on the sprawling Langston plantation, his earliest memories a blur of heat, iron, and the relentless crack of the overseer's whip. The cotton fields stretched endlessly beneath the Virginia sun, each row a testament to labor enforced by violence. From the moment he could grasp a hammer, Ezekiel was drawn to the blacksmith's forge, the small, smoky building at the edge of the property where the air smelled of molten metal, coal, and sweat. There, under the watchful eyes of the white masters, he learned the language of iron, each strike of the hammer resonating like a pulse, shaping not only tools but a quiet, growing determination. Even as a boy, Ezekiel endured cruelty that would have broken a lesser soul. Overseers reveled in punishment, lashing his back with whips braided from rawhide, leaving scars that burned long after the sun had set. Yet every scar was also a marker of resilience. While others bent beneath tyranny, Ezekiel's mind began to forge a different kind of strength, one hidden beneath obedience and silence, like steel annealed in secret. The forge became his sanctuary. Flames licked the walls, sending sparks into the night, and the rhythm of hammer on iron became a language all his own. He studied the tempering of metals, the curves of anvils, the weight of tools, and, in the flickering shadows, he began to envision instruments not just for labor but for retribution. He sketched designs on scraps of wood, imagining cold, heavy coffins, iron graves, strong enough to contain the lives of those who thought themselves untouchable. The plantation watched him, unaware of the storm growing within the quiet boy. His movements were careful, precise, always beneath the threshold of suspicion. He learned to wait, to appear subservient, while his mind worked tirelessly. Each overseer's cruelty became data, how they moved, how they struck, how their pride could be undermined. Each act of violence was recorded, etched into his memory like inscriptions in iron. By the time Ezekiel reached adolescence, his hands were calloused and strong, his body shaped by labor, his spirit tempered like the metals he worked. The Langston plantation remained a place of suffering, but within the smoke and fire of the forge, a quiet reckoning was being fashioned, one strike, one hammer, one coffin at a time. Ezekiel's adolescence was defined by suffering and observation. The overseers of the Langston plantation prided themselves on absolute control, cracking whips with a precision that left no space for mercy. Each lash was meant to break the body, to crush the spirit, yet Ezekiel endured, silently recording every movement, every weakness, every arrogance in the men who ruled the fields. His hands, scarred and calloused, gripped the hammer with growing purpose, knowing that one day, the tools of labor could become instruments of justice. It began one oppressive afternoon. The sun scorched the earth, tanning the dust to a shimmering haze. Ezekiel's back was raw from repeated lashes for a minor misstep in the blacksmith shop. Overseer Clayton, a man notorious for cruelty, circled him like a predator, eyes glinting with the promise of punishment. Each strike of the whip tore through skin and bone, echoing across the fields. But Ezekiel, though trembling, did not falter in thought. He memorized Clayton's posture, the pattern of his swings, the exact moment his arrogance left him exposed. That night, in the solitude of the forge, Ezekiel poured his fury into metal. He worked until the coals burned his skin and the sweat burned his eyes. He shaped a thick slab of iron, hammering it into the first of many designs that had haunted his mind for years. A coffin, cold and impenetrable, capable of holding the weight of men who thought themselves untouchable. Each rivet and curve was measured for precision, forged not from madness but from a meticulous plan born of survival and vengeance. As dawn approached, the first iron grave was complete. The firelight had danced on its blackened surface, revealing a chilling reflection of the boy who had endured so much yet emerged unbroken. He whispered a vow to the empty shop. For every lash, every scar, every insult, a final resting place would be prepared. Not for bodies of the innocent, but for those who wielded cruelty as power. Word of his meticulous work spread quietly among the enslaved community, a whispered legend. They spoke of the boy who did not merely endure but prepared for retribution. His eyes, once downcast in submission, now held a cold fire, the kind that only comes when suffering is transformed into purpose. Outside, the Langston plantation continued in its oppressive rhythm, unaware that one of its own had begun to craft an inevitable reckoning. The first strike of vengeance was ready, silent, ironbound, and patient. Overseer Clayton returned to the fields the following morning with his usual swagger, confident that his authority was unassailable. He did not see the quiet eyes of Ezekiel, the young blacksmith who moved with precision, measuring every step, every gesture, every weakness. The men and women of the plantation worked under the weight of fear, their backs bent beneath the sun, their hands raw from toil. Yet beneath the surface of obedience, Ezekiel's resolve simmered like molten iron in the forge. Clayton's cruelty had become predictable, almost ritualistic. He would circle the fields, whip in hand, seeking mistakes, punishing even minor lapses with a ferocity meant to instill terror. The workers learned to anticipate the rhythm of his anger, yet Ezekiel observed not for survival alone, but to study the very mechanics of hubris, how power blinds even the strongest, how arrogance exposes vulnerabilities. Each lash left a scar. Each insult etched another line of meticulous calculation into his mind. In the forge, Ezekiel worked relentlessly. He reshaped iron, tempering it again and again, until each coffin was flawless, a precise instrument of revenge. He imagined Clayton's weight, his arrogance, the way he moved when he thought himself untouchable. The iron felt alive beneath Ezekiel's hammer, as if it understood the purpose it had, been summoned to serve. Sparks flew like distant stars as he hammered and bent, each strike echoing the promise of inevitable reckoning. That night, whispers of rebellion fluttered through the quarters. The enslaved men and women spoke in hushed tones about the boy who would not bend, the blacksmith whose hands carried the weight of both labor and vengeance. None could openly speak of his work, yet in the shadows of the cabins, his reputation grew. Ezekiel did not seek praise. He sought patience, the slow forging of inevitability. By the time Clayton returned for his usual inspection, subtle signs hinted that the balance of fear was shifting. Tools left in the forge were rearranged with a deliberate order. Iron slabs gleamed faintly in the firelight, and the hum of the coals carried an almost audible warning. Clayton laughed, unaware, calling Ezekiel to the forge for repairs. The boy complied, hammer in hand, eyes calm, but within them burned a silent promise. The next encounter would not end in pain for him. And somewhere in the shadows of the plantation, the first coffin waited, ready, cold, and merciless, for the man who thought himself untouchable. The night came heavy with heat and a low, restless wind. Ezekiel slipped quietly to the forge, alone, carrying the iron slab he had spent weeks tempering. Sweat clung to his skin, mixing with soot and the faint tang of molten metal, yet his movements were precise, deliberate, each strike of the hammer shaping not just iron, but the culmination of years of silent suffering. In the shadows, the glow of the fire danced on his face, revealing a calm determination that no lash, no insult, and no scar could ever diminish. Overseer Clayton had spent the day reveling in his dominion, oblivious to the quiet preparations in the blacksmith shop. He believed fear alone maintained obedience, never imagining that patience, cunning, and fire could craft a more permanent justice. Ezekiel, by contrast, knew the subtle rhythm of Clayton's arrogance. Every boast, every cruel joke, every punishing lash had been studied and stored, each one a measure for the design of the iron coffin. When the first coffin was complete, its edges were smooth, rivets polished to a dull gleam that caught the firelight like a warning. It was heavy, unyielding, and designed for one purpose, to contain the man who had inflicted pain without remorse. Ezekiel tested the weight, examining the interior dimensions, imagining Clayton's body forced within, and silently whispered a vow. Each coffin would be forged with the same precision, the same cold inevitability. The enslaved men and women whispered of the blacksmith who worked in secrecy, creating instruments of retribution. None dared approach him directly, yet they felt the shift in the air, a subtle tension that promised change. Even the night seemed to hum with anticipation, the coals of the forge glowing hotter, as if aware that the first act of vengeance was imminent. By dawn, Clayton had returned to the forge for repairs, unaware that the iron resting in the shadows carried his name, his arrogance, and his judgment. Ezekiel wiped sweat from his brow, hands steady, eyes calm. The work was done. The first strike had been forged, silent yet unstoppable, and a quiet promise lingered in the smoke-filled air. Cruelty would no longer go unpunished, and for every overseer who struck him, an iron grave awaited. The sun had barely risen when Overseer Clayton approached the fields, oblivious to the weight of the night's labor. His arrogance was habitual. He believed fear ensured obedience, not realizing that patience and cunning could wield a far deadlier power. Ezekiel watched from the forge, pretending to shape iron for mundane tools, while his mind rehearsed the silent ritual he had envisioned countless times. Every movement of Clayton's body, every gesture of superiority, had been recorded, studied, and accounted for. That afternoon, the first opportunity arose. Clayton inspected the newly repaired plows, gesturing impatiently and issuing orders with his usual cruelty. Ezekiel approached under the guise of obedience, carrying the heavy coffin he had forged in the secrecy of the forge. The heat of the midday sun pressed down upon the plantation, mixing with the metallic tang of sweat and the faint scent of coal from the forge. He spoke to Clayton in a quiet, calm tone, offering the tool he had finished, a mundane gift to mask the deadly truth concealed within. Clayton, never suspecting, stepped closer. The weight of the iron coffin was sufficient to startle him as Ezekiel deftly maneuvered it into place. In a flash of brutal efficiency, the overseer was trapped, immobilized, unable to resist. Panic replaced his confidence, his arrogance giving way to terror. The enslaved workers watched from a distance, their fear mingled with awe, as the blacksmith executed what had been decades in the making. The first strike of justice wrought by hands long abused, long patient, and meticulously trained in the art of revenge. Ezekiel's heart pounded, but his expression remained calm. The hammer in his hand was steady, guided by years of suffering and precision. With measured blows, he sealed the coffin, cold iron ringing sharply with each strike. Clayton's screams echoed across the fields, mingling with the cries of the workers, until silence fell like a heavy curtain. Outside, life carried on as if nothing had happened, but within the forge, a chilling inevitability had been realized. The first overseer had met his fate, a victim of the patient, silent vengeance of a boy forged in cruelty and honed in fire. Whispers spread among the enslaved. Ezekiel's revenge had begun, methodical, silent, and unstoppable. News of Overseer Clayton's disappearance rippled through the Langston plantation with a speed that astonished even the enslaved workers. Whispers traveled like wildfire along the dusty roads, through the cabins, and across the fields. No one dared speak openly, yet every glance toward the forge carried the weight of suspicion and fear. The once confident overseers now walked with hesitation, their arrogance tempered by the knowledge that someone had defied the natural order of plantation power, and survived to enact revenge. Ezekiel, though still a young man, had become more than a blacksmith. He had become an unseen force, a shadow that moved silently among the enslaved and the cruel alike. Each night, he returned to the forge, shaping iron with precision and intent. Every rivet, every slab, every curve of metal was carefully measured to ensure that the punishment he had begun could be repeated as necessary. His knowledge of the overseer's habits allowed him to craft each iron coffin with exacting detail, a testament to patience and long-suffering. The remaining overseers began to sense the pattern, though none could articulate it. They noticed small signs, a misplaced tool, a lingering shadow in the forge, or a scrap of iron polished too carefully. Anxiety replaced their arrogance, their control slipping. As unease crept into every corner of the plantation, even those who had long believed themselves untouchable could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on them. Meanwhile, the enslaved workers observed Ezekiel with reverence, a mixture of fear and hope in their eyes. They did not question his purpose. They understood that his vengeance was precise, just, and inevitable. Each act of cruelty by an overseer now carried a cost, a silent reckoning that could strike without warning. The blacksmith had transformed the forge into a theater of judgment, his work as much psychological as physical. By nightfall, the plantation was restless. The sound of the forge hammering echoed faintly across the fields, mingling with whispers in the cabins. Even the wind seemed heavier, carrying a sense of dread through the rows of cotton. Ezekiel paused, wiping soot from his brow, listening to the quiet murmurs of the living and the absent. His eyes glinted in the firelight. Patience, he knew, was as essential as the iron he forged. The next overseer's reckoning was only a matter of time. And so, the fear spread, silent, unstoppable, and inevitable, a shadow cast by a boy who had turned suffering into a weapon that no lash could withstand. The quiet terror that had settled over the Langston plantation only deepened with the coming of the next overseer. Ezekiel had studied every gesture, every habit, every cruel habit of each man who wielded power over the enslaved. He knew the second target well, a man named Whitmore, infamous for his brutal punishments and ruthless discipline. While Clayton had fallen to a combination of surprise and careful planning, Whitmore's downfall required a more precise, patient hand. Ezekiel worked at the forge from dawn until long after dusk, the air thick with soot and the scent of molten metal. The second coffin emerged from the flames, and hammer strikes like a shadow of inevitable justice. Its interior was measured to perfection, the iron slabs meticulously fitted, rivets sharpened to bear the weight of a man too proud to recognize his vulnerability. As the sparks flew, Ezekiel imagined Whitmore's arrogance and cruelty, each movement already calculated in his mind, each reaction anticipated. The enslaved workers whispered in hushed tones as they observed the blacksmith's methodical labor. They understood, without question, that Ezekiel's work was not only a physical act but a psychological one, a message sent across the plantation. Cruelty carries consequences, patient, deliberate, and inevitable. Even those who had remained silent under pain began to feel a flicker of hope. Whitmore, unaware of the impending judgment, continued his daily rounds with the confidence of unchallenged authority. He demanded compliance, barking orders and striking fear into the hearts of those around him. Yet subtle signs began to unsettle him. Tools misplaced, shadows in the corners of the forge, the faint glint of polished iron where none should have been. By the time he noticed, it was already too late. Ezekiel lured Whitmore to the forge under the pretense of inspecting equipment. Calm, patient, and deliberate, he guided the overseer into the trap. The coffin, cold and unyielding, awaited like a silent judge. Whitmore struggled, disbelief etched across his face, but the iron held firm, and the blacksmith's meticulous work left no avenue for escape. By nightfall, the second overseer had joined the first in his iron prison, leaving the plantation in a state of tense uncertainty. Word of the blacksmith's vengeance spread quietly, whispered among fields and cabins. The wrath of patience and skill was not yet spent, and those who inflicted suffering would find no shelter from the iron that Ezekiel forged. The forge had become more than a place of labor. It was now a chamber of inevitability, a silent witness to Ezekiel's transformation from a boy enslaved to a harbinger of reckoning. Each hammer strike echoed like a heartbeat, each spark flying into the night like a fleeting warning. The air was thick with heat, smoke, and the metallic tang of iron, and in the flickering firelight, the blacksmith's hands moved with uncanny precision. To the enslaved, he had become almost mythic, a figure whose quiet patience could shape destiny as surely as he shaped metal. Ezekiel spent hours studying the shadows that crept along the forge walls. He learned to anticipate movements not just of overseers but of the unseen forces that seemed to linger near him. The air itself seemed to hum in response to the iron he molded, a vibration that spoke to something beyond human understanding. Whispers circulated quietly among the workers. The blacksmith's fury was no longer merely for the living. It carried the weight of judgment itself. The next coffin began to take shape with meticulous care. Ezekiel considered every detail, the iron's thickness, the weight of the rivets, the dimensions tailored to the body it would eventually contain. He imagined each overseer in turn, their arrogance, cruelty, and ignorance of the force quietly building against them. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic, each strike of the hammer reinforcing not only the iron but the inevitability of retribution. Even the enslaved workers, who had long endured abuse without hope, felt the change in the plantation's air. Fear mingled with awe, respect for the boy who could turn pain into power, suffering into justice. Some whispered that the forge itself was alive, responding to his intent, and that the iron he shaped carried a voice, a warning, a promise. That night, as Ezekiel wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed the nearly finished coffin, he paused to speak softly into the shadows. Each strike, each act, each lash finds its counter. Patience is the strongest hammer, and inevitability the sharpest edge. The firelight glinted off the polished iron, casting distorted shadows that seemed to watch and wait. Outside, the plantation continued its relentless rhythm, unaware that a silent reckoning had taken root. Within the forge, Ezekiel's whispers and hammer strikes carried a weight that would soon be impossible to ignore. The blacksmith's vengeance was far from complete. The next strike was already being shaped. The fields of the Langston plantation had always been alive with the rhythm of labor and the oppressive gaze of overseers, but now a new tension pulsed through the rows of cotton and corn. The men and women who worked there moved with a cautious, almost conspiratorial awareness. Every glance toward the forge was laden with unspoken understanding. Ezekiel was no longer simply a blacksmith. He had become an instrument of justice, silent yet inexorable. Overseers who had once laughed at the enslaved workers now faltered under an invisible weight. Their confidence wavered. Even small mistakes drew disproportionate anxiety. They noticed subtle changes, the careful arrangement of tools, a spark of iron glinting unnaturally in the firelight, or the sound of the hammer echoing long after the forge should have fallen silent. Unease took root, growing alongside the crops that bent beneath the summer sun. Ezekiel, always patient, used this fear to his advantage. He moved among the fields and cabins under the guise of obedience, silently observing the next targets of his vengeance. Each overseer's habits, pride, and weaknesses were catalogued with precision. In the shadows, he planned, knowing that the iron he forged in the forge would soon meet its destined occupant. The blacksmith had transformed cruelty into a pattern, a slow and unstoppable process of reckoning. At night, the whispers began again. The enslaved spoke softly of coffins wrought with iron, of justice shaped in secrecy and delivered with certainty. They told tales of how Ezekiel had endured, how he had transformed his suffering into patience, and how the very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation of the next overseer's fate. His hammer strikes were no longer merely the work of a craftsman. They were a heartbeat of retribution that echoed across the plantation. One evening, Ezekiel paused at the edge of the fields, sweat and soot coating his skin. The wind carried faint echoes of voices, some living, some remembered, and he whispered into the darkness, "Each lash finds its measure. Each act of cruelty meets its weight." He returned to the forge, hands steady, eyes focused. The next coffin awaited, cold and unyielding, like fate itself. Outside, the fields appeared unchanged, the workers bent beneath the sun as they always had. But in the shadows, patience and inevitability were at work, and the plantation had begun to learn that cruelty has a price, measured in iron, silence, and the relentless will of one who had endured too much to forget. The morning sun burned over the Langston plantation, yet the heat could not match the tension that gripped the overseers. Every step, every glance, carried the weight of unseen judgment. Ezekiel moved among them with the calm of a man who had already seen the outcome, hammer in hand, coal-stained and steady. The blacksmith's patience had matured into a quiet, unrelenting force, and the air itself seemed to tremble with the inevitability of what was to come. Overseer Whitmore, still unnerved by the first disappearance, walked with a stiffness born of anxiety. His arrogance had been eroded by the knowledge that cruelty could be answered in ways unimaginable. Tools left carelessly in the forge, a misplaced scrap of iron, even the faint smell of coal carried warnings that unsettled him. Ezekiel observed silently, noting every tremor of fear, every twitch of muscle, every subtle indication of weakness. He had become a master of prediction, using patience as effectively as any weapon. By midday, the plan was set in motion. Ezekiel lured Whitmore to the forge under the guise of inspection. The second iron coffin waited, polished and precise, crafted to accommodate the overseer's body without flaw. Sweat dripped from Ezekiel's brow, but his hands remained steady, each movement deliberate, every rivet hammered with absolute control. Whitmore, unaware of the trap beneath his feet, stepped closer to his fate. The workers in the quarters sensed the tension, the quiet anticipation that preceded a storm. They moved carefully, glancing toward the forge, knowing that the blacksmith's vengeance was no longer a threat in the shadows. It was imminent, unavoidable. They whispered of patience and skill, of suffering transformed into justice, and of the cold inevitability of iron. Whitmore's panic surged as he realized too late the precision of Ezekiel's plan. The coffin closed around him with a sound sharp as a whip crack, sealing the overseer in darkness and cold. Ezekiel's calm gaze met the last moments of his target's arrogance, and the silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the field seemed unchanged, yet the invisible weight of fear and inevitability hung heavy over every worker, every row of cotton, every trembling overseer. Ezekiel stepped back, breathing steadily, eyes cold but composed. The forge glowed softly behind him, a beacon of silent judgment. He had begun the reckoning, a chain of justice wrought in fire and iron, and the plantation would never again move as it had. The blacksmith's vengeance was no longer a promise, it was reality, unstoppable and patient. By the fall of 1824, the Langston plantation had been transformed, not by rebellion, but by fear so complete it rendered the overseers powerless. Ezekiel, once a boy who bore the lash in silence, had become a living testament to the potency of patience, skill, and meticulous planning. The forge, ever smoky and warm, stood as both workshop and altar, a place where iron had been shaped into judgment and where cruelty had met its unflinching match. The blacksmith had completed coffins for each overseer who had inflicted pain upon him, each one a monument of inevitability. These iron graves were more than vessels, they were warnings, tangible reminders that suffering endured silently could give birth to formidable strength. Word spread quietly through the enslaved community. Ezekiel's vengeance was precise, impartial, and absolute. Even those outside the plantation whispered tales of the boy who had turned oppression into mastery, who had forged justice in fire and wrought retribution in metal. Claudine, who had witnessed her son's transformation, felt awe and fear in equal measure. She understood that the boy she had raised was no longer bound by the rules of the living. He had transcended them. His patience, his intelligence, and his indomitable spirit had become tools as sharp as any blade, capable of reshaping the balance of power in a world long dominated by cruelty. The plantation itself seemed to acknowledge the change. Shadows stretched longer, movements were more cautious, and the air carried an unspoken warning. Overseers who had survived the initial strikes approached their duties with hesitation, aware that their previous certainty had been shattered. Every glance at the forge reminded them that Ezekiel's work was not finished, and that his patience ensured the inevitability of further reckoning. And yet, for all his meticulous planning, Ezekiel's vengeance was measured. There was no cruelty beyond necessity, no malice without reason, only justice exacted with precision, as deliberate as the hammer strikes that had shaped each iron coffin. He had endured more than most could imagine, and in the process had become something greater than mere flesh and bone, a force of inevitability, a guardian of memory, and a harbinger of retribution. As the last hammer fell and the final rivet was set, Ezekiel stepped back to survey his work. The forge glowed softly, embers casting long shadows across the walls. The blacksmith's legacy was clear. Those who inflict suffering will meet consequences. Patience can be the deadliest weapon, and justice, like iron, endures beyond the passage of time.